Berlin, March 17, 1943. A thick folder hit the surface of a wooden desk, hard enough to tilt the coffee cup beside it and leave a brown stain across a set of classified reports. Outside the window, the Landwehr Canal sat under a gray, motionless sky, an image that felt painfully similar to the war sliding into its deadliest phase. Inside the room, the only sound left was the faint rattle of metal as Admiral Wilhelm Canaris opened the first page. The numbers written on that report looked as if they belonged to another world. Willow Run, a Ford plant in America, was assembling one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. A machine weighing 18 tons, built from hundreds of thousands of rivets and tens of thousands of components, coming off an assembly line at a pace faster than Germany could finish a simple military vehicle. Agents in Mexico City, Washington, Madrid, and Stockholm had all reported the same figures. 17 independent channels, 17 rounds of verification. Everything pointed to a cold reality. American industrial output was rising along a mathematical curve that Berlin refused to confront. Canaris stared at the pages, fingers tightening around the paper. One question grew heavier with every line he read. If that assembly line truly operated at this rate, how long could Germany hold the skies over Europe once those bombers arrived in waves? The story begins at that moment. A moment when the truth stood clearly in front of them. Yet Berlin was not ready to believe what its own intelligence had uncovered. Winter's edge still lingered over Berlin in early 1943 as Admiral Wilhelm Canaris walked the dim corridor of the Abwehr headquarters. The building smelled of damp paper and old concrete, a scent familiar to anyone who had spent years surrounded by secrets. Outside, snowmelt flowed down the gutters, carrying with it the quiet heaviness of a war that was shifting into a new and merciless phase. Inside the intelligence service, tension was a permanent resident. Officers moved quickly through the hallways, their boots echoing on the linoleum floors. Most of them carried stacks of documents filled with numbers, production estimates, intercepted messages, field reports, decoded transmissions. These numbers, once treated as neutral data, had gradually become the most dangerous substance in Nazi Germany. If they contradicted ideology, they were ignored. If they challenged assumptions, they were hidden. And if they revealed an uncomfortable truth, the person delivering them risked their career, or worse. Inside his office, Canaris laid out the latest intelligence on his desk. The lamps cast long shadows over the papers. His eyes drifted across the documents, absorbing every detail with the instinct of a man who had grown accustomed to reading past the ink and into the implications. The data all pointed to one thing. American industrial production was reaching a level that no one in Germany had imagined possible. For months, reports had trickled in from agents embedded throughout North and South America. They described factories the size of small cities, assembly lines longer than kilometer-long rail yards, training centers turning civilians into skilled workers within days, and a workforce drawn from groups Nazi ideology considered inferior. Canaris had always been a realist. As he read the numbers, he felt a weight settle deep inside him. It was the weight of a future already written. In early 1942, German intelligence began receiving unusual reports. They came from Mexico City first, seemingly casual remarks overheard during business dinners, conversations between oil executives and traveling American engineers. But the details were strikingly consistent. A Ford plant called Willow Run was being expanded into a manufacturing complex unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Americans were preparing to mass-produce heavy bombers the same way they produced automobiles. Many officers inside the Abwehr scoffed at the idea. They believed building an airplane required the meticulous craftsmanship of a trained engineer, not the repetitive labor of an assembly line worker. They believed American workers lacked discipline. They believed diversity created chaos rather than efficiency. Canaris believed none of those assumptions, and the more reports arrived, the more his concern grew. What troubled him most was the source consistency. Swedes traveling back from Detroit, Spanish diplomats visiting aircraft factories, Japanese attachés reporting from Washington, American workers writing letters to relatives in neutral countries, different languages, different roots, different political motives. Yet every report described the same phenomenon. A single American factory was preparing to surpass the output of the entire German aircraft industry. Within the Abwehr, no one understood the United States better than Oberstleutnant Nikolaus Ritter. He had lived in America for years, walked past skyscrapers rising at impossible speed, and seen factories operate day and night with a scale unmatched anywhere in Europe. In the winter of 1943, Ritter presented his analysis to Canaris. His voice was steady as he delivered the conclusion that had haunted him for weeks. If these figures are correct, and every source confirms them, then Germany has already lost the war. What remains is a question of mathematics and time. It was a shocking statement, but it was not dramatic. Ritter spoke like a man stating a physical law, and Canaris listened with the quiet resignation of someone who had already reached the same conclusion. The Willow Run factory, according to the reports, housed more than 40,000 workers and could produce a B-24 Liberator, a complex, heavy, four-engine bomber, at a rate that seemed absurd. One aircraft every hour, 60 planes in 60 hours, hundreds per month. Meanwhile, German plants struggled to complete even a fraction of that. Ritter placed his report on the table. Canaris folded his hands, staring at the numbers. "How reliable are your sources?" he asked. "Reliable enough to be believed," Ritter replied, "but I fear they won't be." His prediction would prove painfully accurate. As winter turned to spring, Canaris prepared to brief Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe. The meeting took place in a lavish room at Hall, surrounded by hunting trophies, fine carpets, and expensive paintings. Luxuries that stood in stark contrast to the harsh realities of war. Canaris laid out the documents, production charts, intercepted communications, and summaries from aristocrats, businessmen, diplomats, and spies. Göring glanced at the papers and dismissed them with a wave of his hand. "These are exaggerations," he said. "Propaganda meant to frighten us." Canaris insisted. "They come from 17 independent sources." Göring smirked. "Then you have 17 gullible men." He leaned back in his chair, heavy and overconfident. "Americans build refrigerators and razor blades, not machines of war." The response made Canaris feel an icy detachment settle inside him. It was the moment he realized the true enemy was not misinformation, but the refusal to accept information. After the meeting, Ritter approached him in the corridor. "How did he react?" Ritter asked quietly. Canaris shook his head. He laughed. Ritter closed his eyes as if the reaction had been inevitable. While German leadership brushed off the intelligence, America was already operating at a level that redefined modern industry. At Willow Run, engineers redesigned the bomber's structure so that it could be broken into subassemblies. Wings, fuselages, engines, control systems, all manufactured in separate sections and converging like rivers into one enormous flow. A written report captured it succinctly. "The building is so vast that clouds form inside. It sometimes rains within the factory." This was not exaggeration. The structure was so large that the internal atmosphere often condensed into mist. Workers, men and women, white and black, first-generation immigrants and longtime residents, had been trained through a massive apprentice program that could turn a novice into a specialized laborer in hours rather than months. Germany refused to believe this system was possible, but it was happening, and the results were coming off the assembly line every hour. Inside the Abwehr headquarters in Berlin, the atmosphere grew heavier by the day. Officers whispered in hallways about the scale of American production. Many of them had spent their careers believing Germany was the industrial heart of the world. Now they were confronting evidence that contradicted everything they thought they knew. Some clung to ideology, some clung to hope, some clung to silence. But others, like Canaris and Ritter, felt a moral obligation to keep reporting the truth, even when that truth no longer had a place to go. Intelligence analysts compiled charts showing how quickly the American numbers were rising. They placed them next to German production data. The contrast was devastating. A Luftwaffe analyst, reading a comparison sheet, murmured under his breath, "This is not a war we can win." He closed the document quickly, afraid someone might hear him. Fear, not logic, guided the German war machine in those years, and fear drove men to destroy their own warnings rather than confront them. By mid-1943, Abwehr officers finally grasped the magnitude of the threat Willow Run represented. But no matter how detailed the reports were, they hit the same wall at the top of command. Canaris decided that one more attempt should be made. He would present the intelligence directly to Hitler. The meeting took place at the Wolfschanze, surrounded by maps of the Eastern Front. Canaris stepped forward, placing photographs and documents on the table. "Mein Führer," he said steadily, "if these production rates continue, American bombers will soon outnumber anything we can field in the air." Hitler barely looked at the papers. "Impossible," he said. "A bomber is not a car." Canaris wanted to argue, but he knew the danger. Instead, he laid down the final piece of evidence, film footage smuggled through Switzerland, showing the Willow Run assembly line in operation. Hitler refused to watch it. And in that moment, the strategic prelude of the tragedy was complete. The warnings had been delivered. The truth had been shown, and the leadership chose blindness. The storm of steel that would soon engulf Germany had already been set in motion. The following weeks inside the Abwehr felt like watching a slow, silent descent. Reports continued to arrive from every corner of the world, each confirming the same reality that Germany's leadership refused to acknowledge. In Mexico City, informants detailed conversations overheard among American oil executives. One man described touring Willow Run and witnessing a mile-long line of machinery, workers moving with clockwork precision, and sub-assemblies merging like streams into a powerful river. The description seemed fantastical to German analysts at first, but when Spanish and Swedish sources described identical processes, the pattern became undeniable. In Stockholm, a Swedish engineer named Lundberg submitted technical drawings and written notes summarizing his visit to the plant. His account was methodical, no embellishment, no political agenda. He wrote, "American tooling capability is beyond anything in Europe. Specialized machines exist here by the thousands. Each performs a single task with extreme efficiency. Their scale of investment indicates long-term strategic planning." That phrase haunted Canaris. Germany had not planned for a long war. America had. Meanwhile, intelligence coming through Ankara confirmed the same numbers. A Turkish intermediary working with German operatives reported that American aircraft production was accelerating faster than anticipated. He carried shipping manifests, industrial export data, and eyewitness accounts collected from businessmen in Detroit. Each packet of intelligence stacked upon the last, forming a towering wall of evidence. Yet that wall was not allowed to reach those who needed to see it. Ritter often stayed late in his office, reviewing the incoming material. The dim lamp on his desk cast a narrow circle of light, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. His fingers traced the lines of a chart showing American monthly production, climbing upward like a steep, unstoppable slope. At the far right of the graph was a bold number, 1,400 B 24 seconds per month at peak. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. Germany had never produced anything close to that number in any category, even at its peak industrial mobilization. And with Allied bombing, crippling transportation networks, even maintaining existing output was becoming difficult. Germany's industrial layout, scattered factories, limited standardization, and restrictions from strategic bombing made scaling impossible. Willow Run, by contrast, centralized everything into one massive system. Ritter wrote in his notebook, "This is the logical endpoint of industrial mass production. If America commits fully, air dominance becomes inevitable." He paused, then added another line, "And they have committed." One of the most unsettling details for Nazi leadership was the composition of the American workforce. German doctrine insisted that only a pure population could excel in technical endeavors. But every report from American soil said the opposite. At Willow Run, black workers operated precision machinery. Women managed logistics and installed hydraulic systems. Immigrants from dozens of nations worked side by side on the same assembly lines. This reality contradicted the ideological spine of the Third Reich, and for that reason, it was dismissed before it was ever considered. But for Ritter, the lesson was clear. The Americans had discovered that diversity was not a weakness, it was a resource. He wrote in another report, "They are drawing strength from groups we refuse to acknowledge. This will decide the war." This particular line never made it past mid-level review. A red pencil mark crossed it out. In the margin, someone had written, "Politically unacceptable." It was one of many examples of how truth was filtered, reshaped, and eventually suffocated inside the German command structure. While the Abwehr wrestled with industrial reports, the Eastern Front began to crack. Soviet offensives pushed deeper into Ukrainian and Polish territories. Supply routes were stretched thin. Fuel shortages grew severe. Every logistical failure on the Eastern Front mirrored the warnings coming from Willow Run intelligence. Germany was fighting a war of attrition without the capacity to replenish. Meanwhile, American manufacturing operated with the opposite reality. Each month produced more aircraft, more vehicles, more munitions, more trained personnel. Ritter saw the connection clearly. In his next briefing, he stated, "The Eastern Front will not collapse from military defeat alone. It will collapse because we lack the industrial strength to replace losses." A junior officer responded sharply, "That is a defeatist statement." Ritter replied with a calm voice, "It is an arithmetic statement." But arithmetic had become dangerous in a country where ideology determined truth. By late 1943, the Abwehr had compiled enough data to produce a comprehensive summary. The most complete assessment of American aircraft production Germany would ever create. The document was over 100 pages long, filled with graphs, estimates, personnel counts, factory blueprints, intercepted communications, and comparative tables. It was delivered to Göring. It was delivered to Luftwaffe Command. It was scheduled to be delivered to Hitler. Only the last delivery never happened. The folder was intercepted by a senior official who labeled it unverified and withheld it from forwarding. Years later, during interrogation, the official admitted, "If I had sent that document to the Führer, I would have been accused of defeatism." Truth had become a liability, and Germany entered 1944 without adjusting its strategy to the industrial hurricane it was about to face. On February 20th, 1944, American and British forces launched Operation Argument, later known as Big Week. Thousands of bombers rose from airfields across England. Their goal, destroy the German aircraft production network. The scene from the ground was unlike anything Germany had ever witnessed. Air raid sirens blared as waves of B-17 and B-24s filled the horizon. Civilians watched with a mix of dread and disbelief. Soldiers stared at the sky as if looking at a force of nature. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most respected fighter aces, later wrote, "It was as if the sky itself was divided into layers of American aircraft. I had never imagined such numbers." For Ritter, Big Week was the physical manifestation of every chart, every report, every intercepted message he had tried to warn them about. When he received the casualty analysis from Luftwaffe Command, he felt no surprise, only the deep ache of inevitability. Operation Argument was the turning point. It proved that American production had reached overwhelming scale, and Germany had entered this new phase blindfolded. By the time spring arrived in 1944, the pattern of the war had changed irreversibly. American aircraft output was no longer a projection. It was an unassailable fact carved into the skies of Europe. Luftwaffe fighter groups suffered catastrophic losses. Replacement aircraft arrived too slowly. Replacement pilots arrived with too little training. Fuel stocks dwindled. Aircraft quality varied wildly due to bombed factories and rushed assembly. Meanwhile, Willow Run delivered bombers with machine-like consistency. Every hour, another B-24 rolled out. Every day, dozens of them took flight. Every month, hundreds joined the Allied air fleets. Inside the Abwehr, Canaris and Ritter understood the full weight of what had occurred. Their reports had been accurate. Their warnings had been clear. Their conclusions had been mathematically sound. The tragedy was not in the intelligence. The tragedy was in its rejection. As Ritter walked down the corridor one evening, he paused at a window overlooking the gray streets of Berlin. Smoke drifted in the distance from another bombing raid. He whispered to himself, though no one was nearby to hear, "It didn't have to end this way." The strategic prelude was over. The disaster it foretold was now unfolding, and nothing in Germany's arsenal, neither technology, nor ideology, nor hope, could change the trajectory of what was coming. By the end of 1943, Germany entered a strange and unstable phase. Intelligence officers kept placing figures on the desks of senior commanders, figures detailing American aircraft production, material flow, and industrial expansion. Yet each set of numbers seemed to disappear the moment it reached the upper tier of leadership. Reports from the Economic Office of the SS confirmed that American access to raw materials was deepening. The Ministry of Economics quietly circulated warnings that U.S. investment in aviation tooling had surpassed all expectations. But inside the highest councils of the Third Reich, the sentiment was unchanged. America is bluffing. This was the core of the problem. The German leadership's worldview was built on assumptions that were never re-examined. They believed American workers lacked discipline. They believed a multi-ethnic society could not achieve cohesion. They believed American industry was too unrefined to produce complex war machinery. These beliefs were woven deeply into Nazi ideology, and anything that contradicted them was seen as suspect. Inside this environment of intellectual rigidity, the reports from Canaris, Ritter, and their networks felt like warnings shouted into a void. In late 1943, Luftwaffe command faced a strategic crossroads. Option 1, shift national production toward light and medium fighter aircraft, strengthen air defense, and abandon ambitions of longer-range bombing. Option 2, maintain the mixed strategy, produce bombers, develop Wunderwaffen, invest in experimental designs, and sustain politically motivated projects. The debate grew fierce. Ritter, along with analysts from the Abwehr and Luftwaffe's economics division, argued that without an overwhelming number of fighters, Germany would lose the skies within a year. They emphasized that Willow Run and other American plants were reaching a scale that Germany could never match. But Hermann Göring clung to the belief that German pilots' skill and morale would offset American quantity. In one heated meeting, he declared, "A flood of machines cannot defeat German spirit." He dismissed the suggestion that the Luftwaffe refocus its priorities. For Göring, admitting that America was outproducing Germany meant admitting that the Reich's racial ideology had been flawed from the beginning, and so the shift never came. Meanwhile, engineers working on the Me-262 jet fighter begged for priority. They also pushed for a pure fighter version of the aircraft, fast, agile, built to intercept Allied bombers. But Hitler insisted it be developed as a Blitz bomber, a jet-capable bomber. This decision delayed its deployment by months. Those months would prove decisive. While Berlin argued in circles, Willow Run entered its period of smoothest operation. During the spring of 1943, plant managers improved workflow, rearranged floor space, and perfected subassembly timing. New training programs turned inexperienced recruits into specialized workers in 72 hours. Ford's apprentice school churned out trained personnel at a scale the Abwehr initially refused to believe. Reports arriving at Abwehr headquarters described an almost surreal scene. Workers eating lunch beside the conveyor lines. Mechanics sleeping on blankets near their stations to catch a few hours before the next shift. Supervisors coordinating subassemblies with the precision of a military operation. Sections of the factory where fog formed at dawn because of the sheer size of the building. German analysts read these accounts in disbelief. They had been taught that German discipline was unmatched, and yet here was evidence that American civilians, women, immigrants, black workers, inexperienced youths, were operating with a level of efficiency that Nazi ideology claimed was impossible. But American motivation was different. They were not working for propaganda, not for racial mythology, not for political doctrine. They were working because brothers, husbands, sons, and friends were fighting overseas. Each rivet was personal. U.S. labor had something the Nazi system could not produce: a shared belief in the purpose of their work. On February 20th, 1944, everything that Ritter had predicted began to unfold in the sky above Germany. This was Operation Argument. History would call it Big Week. For the first time, the U.S. Army Air Forces and the British RAF coordinated a massive, sustained, multi-day campaign focused entirely on destroying the German aircraft industry. It was not simply a bombing raid. It was an industrial confrontation. Steel against steel, numbers against numbers. Hundreds of heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force rose from English airfields, forming groups so enormous that observers on the ground described them as floating continents. Their contrails etched white scars across the cold sky as fighter escorts stretched out on both flanks. Inside Germany, the reaction was immediate. air raid sirens, scrambling pilots, flak batteries roaring to life. Adolf Gallen, one of the Luftwaffe's most skilled fighter commanders, later said, "The sky appeared layered, bombers above, bombers below, fighters on every plane of movement. It felt less like an air force and more like a continental mass drifting over Germany." The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the fight, but the battle exposed a fatal imbalance. Every American bomber that was shot down could be replaced within days. Every German fighter lost was a blow the Luftwaffe could barely recover from. For Ritter, the reports arriving after Big Week were devastating, but not unexpected. He read casualty tables with a grim sense of déjà vu. His predictions from 1943 were now reality. After Big Week, even the most optimistic officers within the Luftwaffe felt the shift. A classified document from March 1944 described the situation bluntly. "Air saturation is occurring. We are unable to redeploy fighters fast enough to counter the scale of enemy operations." It was the first acknowledgement from within the Luftwaffe that they were losing the war in the air. During a briefing at a forward air base, a staff officer showed a chart depicting bomber formations observed over the Ruhr. One pilot asked, "How many bombers were counted?" The officer swallowed. "Over 800 in a single wave." The room fell silent. This number was not an estimate. It was confirmed by multiple observers, and it was a number the Luftwaffe had no strategic answer for. For Ritter, this was the turning point within the German command itself. Not a turning point of hope, but of realization. Big Week made the truth undeniable. It wasn't that the Americans had more planes, it was that they had the capacity to replace them without strain. That was the difference between winning and losing. In the months following Big Week, the truth slowly seeped into areas of German command previously shielded from inconvenient information. Reports from the Eastern Front confirmed that Soviet air power was also expanding. German pilots began writing home about being outnumbered even during defensive operations. Aircraft maintenance units requested spare parts that no longer existed. Fuel deliveries fell to record lows. Amid this chaos, Ritter prepared another analysis, one he knew would be his last attempt at strategic warning. He wrote, "By summer, the enemy will possess enough heavy bombers to achieve continuous operational cycles. Luftwaffe resistance will degrade sharply." He added a personal note in smaller handwriting. "This is not speculation. It is the continuation of the curve we observed last year." He sent the report through proper channels. Weeks passed. No reply came. But the silence was an answer, and Ritter understood its meaning. The intelligence was no longer being suppressed. It was simply too late to act on it. By summer 1944, Germany no longer controlled its own airspace. From Normandy to Berlin, the constant hum of American bombers filled the skies. Luftwaffe units operated from improvised fields, short on fuel, short on pilots, short on aircraft. The turning point had arrived not with a single event, but with a convergence of factors: industrial imbalance, strategic blindness, leadership arrogance, and suppression of intelligence. Ritter read frontline reports with a feeling that mixed sorrow and clarity. He saw phrases like, "We cannot hold the line," "enemy formations too large to intercept," "replacement aircraft insufficient." Each sentence mirrored what he had been warning for 2 years. The truth had finally reached the front, but it arrived long after it could have made a difference. The landing/turning point was complete. Germany had crossed the threshold from which there was no return. After Big Week, The cracks in Germany's defenses widened into fractures. What had begun as a crisis of intelligence now became a crisis of survival. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was running on fumes, short of aircraft, short of fuel, short of seasoned pilots. The scale of American air power, flowing steadily from factories like Willow Run, pushed the German command toward a realization it could no longer avoid. But instead of accepting the implications, Berlin turned its frustration inward. Inside Luftwaffe headquarters, meetings grew tense. Officers argued not about how to solve the crisis, but about who was at fault. Hermann Göring lashed out at subordinates, accusing them of incompetence, cowardice, and lack of imagination. His temper grew worse as reports poured in, describing formations of Allied bombers so large they cast shadows over entire districts. In one meeting recorded by a staff officer, Göring slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "There cannot be that many aircraft. I refuse to believe it." The officer writing the account later noted, "It was not a debate about numbers. It was a debate against reality itself." Ritter, listening to rumors circulating through the intelligence corridors, understood what was happening. When leaders refuse to face facts, the system collapses from the top down. His team had spent years gathering intelligence with extraordinary precision. Now the information was seen as poison, evidence of truths that no one wanted to confront. Some officers proposed radical ideas, dispersing the aircraft industry across forests, underground tunnels, mines, mountains. But these ideas required months or years Germany no longer had. Others pushed for miracle weapons, jet fighters, long-range missiles, flying wings. But even if these projects succeeded, American factories would respond by scaling production further, because they had the capacity to do so. Germany had no equivalent answer. By mid-1944, the German logistical system resembled a map of failing blood vessels. Rail networks were disrupted by Allied bombing. Fuel depots were targeted relentlessly. Roads clogged with retreating units. Warehouses emptied faster than they could be replenished. From the ruins of Hamburg to the factories of the Ruhr, the same problem repeated. Germany could not move what little it had left. A report from the Transportation Ministry stated, "The enemy destroys more rolling stock in 1 week than we can replace in 2 months." Ritter read these reports in silence. He knew that Willow Run's true power was not the bombers themselves, but the infrastructure behind them. Supply chains, logistics, procurement teams, standardization, communication networks, worker training, and raw material access. The Americans did not merely build machines. They built a massive system capable of feeding those machines indefinitely. The Luftwaffe, once built for rapid strikes, now suffocated under the pressure of constant defense. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, Germany witnessed the consequences of its miscalculations with brutal clarity. As Allied ships approached the French coast, thousands of aircraft filled the sky above them. Bombers, fighters, reconnaissance planes, American, British, and Canadian squadrons, operating with full coordination. They struck rail hubs, communication centers, troop concentrations, and anti-aircraft positions. German infantry on the beaches reported, "The sky was never empty." Luftwaffe response was minimal. The fighters that did scramble lacked fuel for extended combat. Others never left the ground. Entire airfields were destroyed before a single aircraft could take off. For troops on the front lines, it felt like abandonment. They fought under a sky dominated entirely by Allied forces, a sky Germany no longer had the ability to challenge. An officer in the 352nd Infantry Division wrote in his diary, We do not fight the enemy. We endure them. This moment marked the irrevocable turning point. Air supremacy had transitioned from an operational advantage to a strategic inevitability. The Luftwaffe would never regain control of the skies. As the months passed, the human consequences of the intelligence failure grew more severe. Young pilots trained in haste were rushed into cockpits with barely a handful of flight hours. Many died during landing attempts or fuel shortages before ever seeing combat. Those who did survive the initial training often faced overwhelming odds in the air. One squadron report noted, "New pilots last an average of 3 flights." Meanwhile, American pilots rotated, trained, and were replaced through a system that functioned with astonishing consistency. They had fuel, spare parts, rest periods, medical care, and aircraft that arrived in endless waves. Ritter once told a colleague, "It is not their bravery that overwhelms us. It is the system that protects their bravery." Germany's system, in contrast, consumed its young without mercy. At the same time, civilians in German cities endured unrelenting bombing campaigns. Industrial centers flattened, residential districts burned, transportation networks destroyed, and as cities suffered, the nation's capacity to recover shrank further. Canaris, watching from within the Abwehr, knew exactly why this was happening. The numbers had predicted it. The intelligence had been clear. The warnings had been delivered, but ideology had drowned out arithmetic. In April 1944, Willow Run reached its legendary peak, one completed B-24 every 63 minutes. This rate was not symbolic. It was sustained for months. American officers visiting the plant described it as a living organism, a system of machinery, workers, conveyors, cranes, welders, and inspectors, all moving in a synchronized rhythm. At the end of the line, completed bombers were towed outside, fueled, tests flown, and deployed across the Atlantic. Every hour, another machine joined the swarm, filling Europe's sky. Germany had no answer for this scale, no countermeasure, no plan. Willow Run had become something far greater than a factory. It was the industrial heartbeat of a nation at war, and Germany felt every beat. By late summer 1944, the German High Command received reports so grim that even the most fervent believers in Nazi ideology began to waver. A confidential briefing stated, "We no longer possess the means to regain air parity." Another, "Production targets are unreachable due to industrial collapse." Another, "Fuel reserves insufficient for sustained operations." Hitler dismissed these reports. Göring raged against them. Himmler demanded executions for defeatism. But the documents were true. By autumn, Allied aircraft controlled the skies from the French coast to the German border. Bombers struck targets deep inside the Reich with impunity. Fighter escorts roamed freely, engaging Luftwaffe units before they could reach formation altitude. Ritter watched this unfold with a terrible clarity. Each new report felt like the final line in a long equation that had been solved years before. He once wrote privately, "A nation is defeated when it ignores the truth of its circumstances. We are defeated long before the final battles begin." In October 1944, German morale began to collapse openly. Factories struggled to function. Workers grew exhausted, anxious, fearful. Anti-aircraft crews lost confidence. Civilians fled cities in waves. Pilots wrote home letters filled with resignation. One Luftwaffe commander summarized the mood in a single sentence: "We do not know how to fight a war that is already mathematically lost." Ritter understood this sentiment intimately. Intelligence was never about heroics or ideology. It was about recognizing patterns, predicting outcomes, and preparing accordingly. Germany had refused to do any of these. The turning point was not merely military, it was psychological. Even those who never saw the inside of an intelligence report could feel the inevitability in their bones. In December 1944, a secret Abwehr memo circulated through the remaining operational channels. It read, "American aircraft production has surpassed 80,000 units for the year. German capacity is below 10,000. The memo went on, "We anticipate enemy dominance in all air operations for the duration of the war." This was the final confirmation, not a prediction, not a warning, but a statement of reality. The turning point had passed. Germany had crossed into the final phase of the war, an irreversible downward slope from which no strategy, no weapon, no bravado could pull them back. And in the quiet rooms of the Abwehr, Ritter closed the final report of the year, placed it on his desk, and whispered into the empty office, "They will never understand that this was decided long ago." By the end of 1944, Germany was fighting inside a world of shrinking horizons. Every week brought a new loss: territory, factories, airfields, fuel reserves, supply depots, trained pilots. The Luftwaffe no longer resembled the force that had once dominated European skies. Its surviving units operated like scattered fragments, disconnected, under-resourced, and increasingly irrelevant against the vast machinery of American aerial power. Across the continent, the sky had become a weapon America wielded with relentless precision. What followed for Germany was not merely defeat, it was a descent into a kind of internal hell, one created by their own illusions, sustained by their leadership, and now made unavoidable by the cold arithmetic of industrial war. As American and British bombers intensified their operations, German cities lived beneath a constant shadow. Sirens became part of daily life. People slept fully clothed, prepared to rush to basements or shelters. Families memorized the distance between the nearest bunkers. Entire neighborhoods learned to read the tone of engines, whether they were bombers or escorts, whether they were passing through or preparing to strike. A civilian diary from Essen recorded, "We no longer ask if they will come today, we ask when." From the air, bomber crews saw a landscape that illuminated in flashes of white and orange as anti-aircraft guns filled the darkness. But the flak below, fierce and desperate, was no longer enough. The Luftwaffe could not mount a meaningful interception. The American formations were simply too large, too well coordinated, too consistent. A navigator from the 8th Air Force recalled, "It felt like we were flying over a land where time had stopped. Factories burning, trains frozen in place, roads empty. Everything below us looked defeated before we even dropped a single bomb." Each formation that crossed the Rhine or the Ruhr deepened the sense of irreversible decline within Germany. But above all, it deepened the silence inside the Abwehr. Canaris and Ritter no longer needed intelligence reports to know how the war was unfolding. They could hear it every night in the drone of engines passing overhead. The heart of the Luftwaffe's crisis was simple. The fighters were gone. During the first years of the war, German fighter units were the pride of the Reich. Their aces had become legends. Their tactics were studied. Their victories were trumpeted in newsreels. But by late 1944, those same units were starved of everything they relied on. Fuel shortages forced pilots to limit training flights to a minimum. New pilots, some barely 18, entered combat with fewer than 20 flight hours. Many had never shot a live round from their aircraft's guns before their first sortie. Squadron leaders wrote desperate letters to command. We have aircraft but no fuel. We have fuel but no pilots. We have pilots but no spare parts. For a Luftwaffe squadron to be airborne at all required a chain of miracles. And even when fighters did take off, they faced formations of American escorts, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, Lightnings, outnumbering them 3 or 4 to 1. A German pilot later wrote, "When we climbed, they were already above us. When we turned, there were more behind us. When we dove, they followed. We were hunted from the moment our wheels left the ground." This was the hell within for the fighter arm. Not a battlefield, but a trap. If pilots suffered in the sky, ground crews suffered in another way, one marked by exhaustion, desperation, and the slow disintegration of order. Hangars were destroyed faster than they could be repaired. Spare parts arrived in crates that never matched the aircraft in front of them. Engines were cannibalized from wrecks. Mechanics slept inside bomb craters because they were too exhausted to walk back to their quarters. In one airfield near Kassel, a chief mechanic recorded, "We patch wings with sheet metal from destroyed barns. We weld with equipment meant for automobiles. We pray the engines will hold for 1 hour." The Luftwaffe had once prided itself on precision engineering. Now it survived through improvisation. The Americans, by contrast, had entire supply chains. Every component, valve, bolt, gasket, panel, cable, arrived on the exact schedule the factories promised. For every B-24 completed at Willow Run, thousands of spare parts were shipped along with it. It was not simply production, it was organization, and Germany could not imitate it. By winter, the greatest damage inflicted by American air supremacy was not physical, but psychological. Cities were burning, factories were rubble, the front was collapsing in both east and west. But what terrified German command the most was a quiet, spreading truth. Most Germans had stopped believing in victory. Letters intercepted by the Gestapo revealed phrases like, "We cannot hold." "The Americans never stop. The sky belongs to them." Even soldiers at the front wrote similar words. One Wehrmacht corporal in Normandy wrote, "Each day begins with their aircraft overhead. We move only at night. We dig deeper. We hide in barns and forests. This is not war. It is survival." The psychological shift was undeniable. The Third Reich had begun the war with confidence. Now doubt infected every rank, every city, every bunker. The hell within was not just destruction, it was the collapse of belief. The Abwehr itself was falling apart. Canaris, under suspicion for months, found his influence shrinking. His warnings were ignored. His networks were disrupted. His officers were monitored. Suspicion replaced cooperation. Fear replaced analysis. Ritter felt the suffocating atmosphere tighten around him. Every report he produced was reviewed for defeatist tendencies. Every conclusion was questioned. Every number had to be justified twice, sometimes 3 times. Yet no amount of evidence mattered. The leadership had already closed its ears. For professionals trained to see patterns, the tragedy was unbearable. They had foreseen the industrial imbalance. They had predicted the consequences. They had understood the math. But the math had been rejected. In late 1944, Ritter wrote a note in his personal journal. "The most painful thing for an intelligence officer is not that he is ignored. It is that he is proven right too late." He closed the journal knowing the truth. Germany was now trapped in the final stage of its own denial. As the Luftwaffe collapsed, American operations grew increasingly systematic. Each bombing raid followed a doctrine, rigid timing, exact formation height, layered escort, pre-planned flak suppression, post-strike photo analysis, rapid debrief cycles, redesign of tactics within days. America fought a mechanized war even in the sky. Germany fought by instinct, improvisation, and last-minute decisions, and each month instinct lost more ground. A U.S. 8th Air Force planner remarked, "Our strength was not just numbers. It was the system behind the numbers. That system manifested in every mission. If a bomber was lost, a replacement arrived within the week. If a fighter squadron took casualties, new pilots were flown in overnight. If a factory needed more aluminum, trains delivered it from a reserve that seemed endless." Germany had none of this. Germany had hope, pride, desperation, and nothing else. While American daylight raids shattered German industry, British nighttime operations inflicted their own kind of devastation. Cities like Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, Kassel, each endured infernos that remade their landscapes entirely. From the ground, the terror of night bombing was different. The darkness hid incoming aircraft. The silence before impact was suffocating. And once the bombs fell, the world became fire. One survivor from Hamburg described, "The fire was alive. It moved like wind, like water. People ran, but the fire ran faster." Another wrote, "I saw shadows where buildings used to be. These night raids amplified the psychological collapse. No one felt safe. Not civilians, not officials, not soldiers returning from the front. Inside this chaos, rumors spread that thousands of bombers would come next time. Many Germans overestimated Allied numbers because the impact felt so overwhelming. Those rumors were not far from the truth. Willow Run's output ensured that America could send thousands, and eventually they did. In early 1945, the Luftwaffe made its final desperate attempt at relevance. Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack against Allied airfields in the West. Nearly every surviving fighter unit participated. Hundreds of aircraft were committed. It was meant to cripple Allied air power in a single blow, but the operation failed almost immediately. Allied radar detected the formations. Poor navigation scattered German units. Inexperienced pilots misidentified targets. And when the battle began, American fighters, more numerous, better trained, and better supplied, tore through the German formations. The Luftwaffe lost nearly all of its remaining aircraft in a single day. Most of its remaining experienced pilots died. It was their last stand. It was also their final collapse. Ritter received the casualty reports that evening. He read the numbers in silence, then folded the papers slowly. He understood what they signified. The Luftwaffe no longer existed as a fighting force. The skies of Germany belonged entirely to the Allies. The hell within was complete. By the beginning of 1945, Germany had entered a state that historians later described as total systemic exhaustion. Every component of the war machine, industry, logistics, manpower, transportation, intelligence, was strained beyond repair. The Luftwaffe's remains had scattered across makeshift airfields, many no longer possessing fuel, spare parts, or serviceable runways. What remained of the German defensive forces understood the truth. The war in the air had already been lost. What followed was not combat in the traditional sense, but endurance within a collapsing world. In January 1945, American bombers flew missions with increasing frequency. Weather no longer deterred them. Snowstorms, cloud cover, fog, none of it mattered. Radar-guided bombing, Pathfinder aircraft and improved navigation allowed the Allied air forces to strike targets even when the land below was invisible. A German witness in Frankfurt wrote, "We hear them even when we cannot see them. The sound is more frightening than the bombs." Another civilian recalled, "There is no night, there is no day, only the constant hum." The psychological burden of living beneath perpetual bombardment carved deep scars into the population. Children flinched at distant thunder. Adults developed a reflexive fear of engine noise. Many families packed emergency bags and kept them by their doors. Inside this environment of tension, trust in the government eroded rapidly. Speeches promising miracle weapons no longer impressed anyone. Propaganda films showing me Tu-62 jet fighters did little to reassure families whose homes had burned. The psychological collapse was complete when the public realized that even the military had lost faith. New Luftwaffe pilots, some barely trained, were ordered into missions that experienced commanders recognized as suicidal. Many were teenagers. They entered a cockpit only to face a sky dominated by American P-51 Mustangs, aircraft faster, better armed, and flown by pilots with hundreds of combat hours. The outcomes were predictable. One young pilot, in a letter never delivered, wrote, "We know before we take off that we will not return. The instructors tell us, climb, fire one burst, and dive. But we never reach the point where we can fire." Another described, "We scramble, and before the wheels are up, they are already above us." These pilots were not failing. They were being sacrificed. Meanwhile, American pilots rotated home after set numbers of missions. Replacement aircraft arrived continuously. Training pipelines were standardized, resourced, and protected. German pilots understood this painfully well. During one interrogation after the war, a surviving pilot said, "We were fighting statistics, not men." Behind the front lines, German engineers and mechanics fought an equally hopeless battle. Workshops were flooded with damaged aircraft, each requiring more parts than Germany could produce. Engines worn beyond limits, landing gear compromised, fuselages warped from stress, electrical systems cannibalized from multiple aircraft, fuel lines patched with cloth and wire. A technical report from February 1945 read, "We are at a point where aircraft are being declared flight-ready only because they can start their engines." Another report noted, "We use aluminum from destroyed bombers to repair fighters. The quality is poor. The lifespan is unpredictable." In contrast, Willow Run was still producing bombers at a stable pace. Even as the war approached its end, the American industrial machine did not slow. It continued delivering aircraft, parts, tools, and crews with mechanical reliability. Germany fought with scraps. America fought with abundance. This was the core of the hell within, a war where one side was already defeated long before its planes hit the ground. By early March 1945, German radar stations were barely operational. Many were destroyed. Others suffered power shortages or lacked trained operators. Luftwaffe command attempted to redeploy radar trucks, but gasoline shortages rendered most immobile. When American bombers approached, alerts became inconsistent. Some cities received warnings too late. Others received none at all. In a secret meeting in Berlin, a senior air defense officer admitted, "We no longer fight the bombers. We endure them." This statement circulated quietly within the Abwehr. It represented the truth that no one wanted to speak openly. Air defense was no longer a strategy. It was a formality. Himmler ordered investigations into defeatism. Goering blamed incompetence. Hitler accused radar operators of sabotage, but none of them could change the reality. The Luftwaffe had ceased to function as a coherent force. Inside the Abwehr, the atmosphere grew suffocating. Many officers sensed the end approaching, both for the war and for themselves. Files were burned. Reports were hidden. Networks disintegrated. Reliable sources fled. Communications grew chaotic. Ritter read the latest American production estimates and set them beside German numbers. The chart resembled a cliff, American output rising, German output plunging. The contrast was so stark that it looked almost abstract, as if it belonged to another world. He closed the folder and whispered, "We cannot explain this to people who refuse to see." For an intelligence officer, the greatest anguish is watching truth suffocate beneath ideology. Ritter and his colleagues had seen the disaster coming. They had measured it. They had documented it in numbers, graphs, diagrams, and reports. Yet none of it mattered. The leadership's belief in racial superiority had trumped every warning. This was the heart of the hell within, the destruction caused not by the enemy, but by one's own blindness. By spring 1945, the Allied air forces had achieved complete operational dominance. Bombers struck Berlin in daylight. Mustangs roamed as far as Prague. Thunderbolts strafed rail yards deep inside Bavaria. Heavy bombers attacked German positions even before ground troops requested support. For American crews, each mission felt less like a battle and more like a confirmation of superiority earned through industry, planning, and logistics. One bombardier said, "By 1945, it felt like the sky belonged to us by right." For German observers on the ground, the image was very different. A Wehrmacht infantry officer wrote, "We are fighting under a moving ceiling of steel. The enemy has built a roof over Europe, and we live beneath it." Another soldier near Remagen described, "The aircraft circle like vultures. We cannot move. We cannot even breathe without them seeing." When the Luftwaffe did appear, the outcome was inevitable. Outnumbered, outgunned, inexperienced pilots flying compromised aircraft, they were swarmed by Allied fighters almost instantly. The German collapse on the ground mirrored the collapse in the air. By April, it was complete. As Berlin crumbled and the Reich entered its final, desperate days, Ritter made one last entry in his journal. "We did not lose the war in 1945. We lost it in 1943 when we refused to accept the truth." He was right. The hell within was not simply destruction, chaos, and bloodshed. It was the internal collapse of a system built on illusion, a system that strangled its own intelligence, a system that punished truth, a system that refused to believe arithmetic. Willow Run had not merely built bombers, it built clarity, the kind of clarity Germany could not face. In the final weeks of the war, American bombers made their last passes over the Reich. Many were aircraft built at Willow Run, machines created by workers who had never seen the battlefields they were transforming. And on the ground, German officers looked up from a world in ruins, finally able to see the truth they had ignored for too long. This was the end that mathematics had predicted. This was the end intelligence had warned of. This was the end ideology had made inevitable. The hell within was complete. By early 1945, the Third Reich had entered its terminal phase. What remained was a state collapsing under the weight of its own decisions, ideological rigidity, strategic blindness, and a refusal to accept the truths its own intelligence service had uncovered years earlier. Every day now felt like an echo of consequences long in motion. While Allied armies crossed rivers and seized cities, the war was also being decided in another domain, the skies. American aircraft, produced in numbers Germany had once dismissed as fantasy, now roamed freely from the Rhine to the Oder. They hunted armor, shattered bridges, tore apart rail lines, and erased entire supply columns within minutes. For Germany, these were the final days not just of a war, but of the worldview that shaped it. In February and March of 1945, remnants of the Luftwaffe attempted to reorganize. New squadrons were assembled. Aircraft were towed from garages, barns, abandoned factories, anywhere a few machines were still intact. Fuel was rationed to the point of absurdity. Some wings were assigned only enough gasoline for one mission a week. Pilots stood on frozen runways watching American bombers cross the sky while they waited for fuel trucks that never arrived. A field officer wrote in his final report, "We have aircraft that cannot fly, pilots who cannot train, and orders that cannot be executed." Yet Berlin continued to issue directives as though victory could be willed into existence. Hitler demanded counterattacks. Goering promised miracles. Propaganda broadcasts spoke of secret weapons. But every promise was drowned out by the roar of Allied engines overhead. One mechanic described the moment he understood the finality of the war. "We heard aircraft, dozens, then hundreds. We did not look up. We no longer had the courage." The Luftwaffe had not merely been defeated. It had been erased as a meaningful force. American daylight raids transformed the interior of Germany into a landscape of devastation. Industrial cities like Essen, Leipzig, Hamburg, and Mannheim no longer functioned as industrial centers. The transportation network, once the arteries feeding the Reich's war machine, had been severed by thousands of bombs dropped with mechanical consistency. Inside Berlin, families lived in basements. Children wore gas masks as toys. Shops boarded up their windows. Bread lines wrapped around blocks of shattered stone. A woman from Cologne wrote in her diary, "The sun rises behind smoke. It sets behind fire." Nothing in Germany's defensive arsenal could stop the raids. Not the remaining fighter units. Not the anti-aircraft batteries. Not the Luftwaffe leadership, which had long lost control of the skies. American bombers no longer feared interception. Their formations flew with confidence forged in Willow Run's assembly lines, where bombers rolled out at a pace that made replacement almost instantaneous. This was the final transformation. America had turned the air war into a production problem. Germany had turned it into a matter of belief. Only one approach could survive. Inside the nearly hollowed-out intelligence headquarters, Ritter read the latest production figures from Allied factories. Even in 1945, even as American armies surged across Europe, Willow Run continued delivering aircraft with a precision that stunned the few remaining analysts. B-24s continued rolling off the line. B-17 factories maintained output. Fighter production, P-51s, P-47s, was accelerating. When Ritter placed these figures beside German numbers, the contrast bordered on surreal. American aircraft production, tens of thousands. German aircraft production, collapsing into the low thousands. American fuel reserves expanding. German fuel reserves nearly gone. American pilot training standardized, stable. German pilot training nearly non-existent. Ritter whispered to himself, "This is the end the numbers promised." He no longer tried to warn superiors. There was no point. The leadership had sealed its fate years earlier when it chose ideology over intelligence. In March, Ritter wrote a private memorandum that would never be delivered. Had we accepted the truth in 1943, millions would not be suffering now. It was not bitterness, It was simply mathematics. As Allied armies pressed toward Berlin, American air superiority became absolute. Germany had no strategic depth left, no factories to rebuild, no rail networks to protect, no reserves to mobilize. Each movement of the Wehrmacht triggered a response from above. A bridge repaired overnight was destroyed by noon. A convoy moving under fog was located by radar and torn apart. An armored column attempting to retreat was strafed until it ceased to exist. In a report found after the war, a German general wrote, "Every decision we make is undone by the sky." This was the essence of modern war, something Germany had failed to understand despite the Abwehr's warnings. Industry, not ideology, determines the future, and America's industry had already decided Germany's fate. In the final months, Germany's civilian population bore the full weight of the collapsing Reich. Food disappeared, water systems broke, electricity failed, hospitals overflowed, churches filled with refugees. American bombers no longer needed to focus on production centers. They targeted transportation routes, oil depots, and railroad junctions, the sinews of the German state. An elderly man from Dresden recalled, "The sky growled like a wild animal. Every hour another wave. Every hour another city broken." Berlin, once the beating political heart of the Reich, was reduced to dust and rubble. Columns of smoke rose each day. Children walked the streets barefoot, carrying buckets of water through debris. Inside this world, belief in Hitler dissolved. Belief in victory vanished. Even belief in survival grew thin. The German people had entered their own internal collapse, the human cost of a war sustained by lies. The Abwehr, once a sophisticated intelligence service, had been gutted by paranoia, sabotage investigations, and internal purges. Canaris was arrested, accused of treason, and imprisoned. In April 1945, he would be executed. The remaining officers understood the fate awaiting them. Some destroyed documents, some fled. Some quietly tried to aid civilians. Others continued working, knowing their reports would never influence anything again. Ritter walked through the nearly empty corridors, hearing only the distant rumble of artillery and the intermittent roar of Allied aircraft overhead. The building felt abandoned long before it was actually evacuated. In his final analysis before Berlin fell, Ritter wrote, "We were not defeated by lack of intelligence, but by the refusal to believe intelligence." These words would not be read until after the war. They would become one of the clearest explanations for the disaster that had unfolded. By mid-April 1945, the battle for Berlin had begun. Soviet forces pressed from the east. American and British bombers continued to pound rail hubs, fuel depots, and remaining strongpoints. The Luftwaffe attempted only symbolic resistance, single aircraft taking off, circling once, and being swallowed by Allied fighters. A German youth defending the streets wrote in his notebook, "We hear the sky tearing apart. Sometimes we cannot tell if it is bombs or the earth cracking." During the final raids, many of the bombers above Berlin had been built at Willow Run, machines born in a factory Germany had dismissed as propaganda. Now they thundered above the dying capital of the Reich. Their shadows passed over a city that had refused to believe they could exist. This was the final irony of the war in the air. The truth Germany rejected became the force that ended it. Inside the Führer bunker, the delusions continued. Hitler spoke of counterattacks. He issued commands to divisions that no longer existed. He referred to Luftwaffe units that had been destroyed months earlier. The last realistic voices in the bunker, generals, staff officers, clerks, said nothing. They no longer saw the point. Above them, the roar of Allied aircraft shook the bunker's walls. Each vibration in the concrete ceiling was a reminder of decisions made years too late. Outside, Berlin burned. Smoke curled into the sky in black pillars that could be seen for miles. American aircraft circled above like patient spectators of the Reich's final collapse. The war did not end with a single blow. It ended through an accumulation of ignored truths. As Soviet troops pushed deeper into the city, American bombers made their final passes. They struck remaining rail lines, fuel depots, and strongholds that still resisted. Their engines echoed across the city's ruins, an undeniable reminder of how industrial power had become the ultimate weapon of the war. Then suddenly the bombing stopped. A Berlin resident wrote in her diary, "The silence terrified us more than the bombs. Silence meant they no longer needed to bomb. We were finished." The Luftwaffe made no more attempts. Its last functioning aircraft had been destroyed on the ground or shot down during their final, hopeless sorties. Pilots who once dreamed of defending the fatherland now walked aimlessly through streets filled with rubble, uniforms torn, boots soaked with mud and soot. The skies, once fought for with such ambition, now belonged entirely to the enemy. Wilhelm Canaris spent the final weeks of his life in chains. Arrested under suspicion of treason months earlier, he had been transferred through various prisons before reaching Flossenburg concentration camp. There in early April 1945, he awaited judgment from a regime that no longer understood the meaning of the word. His execution was ordered without trial. A surviving witness recalled Canaris's last words, "We betrayed ourselves." He wasn't speaking of conspirators. He was speaking of Germany's refusal to accept information that could have changed everything. Ritter received word of Canaris's death 2 days later. He did not react outwardly. He simply folded the message, placed it in a drawer, and returned to his desk. The remaining intelligence reports in front of him felt like relics of a world that no longer existed. The Abwehr would not survive the war. Its final lesson would be understood only years later. As Soviet troops encircled the government district, Hitler retreated deeper into the Führer bunker. His conversations grew detached from the physical world. He spoke of divisions that had been destroyed, air fleets that no longer existed, and counteroffensives that could never be launched. Generals who attempted to present accurate reports were dismissed or ignored. Some were threatened. Others simply stopped trying. Above the bunker, American aircraft continued their missions across northern and central Germany, not because Berlin still mattered strategically, but because the destruction of the German logistical network was nearly complete. The truth had become a physical presence. It was the sound of engines overhead. It was the glow of fires at night. It was the lack of fuel in every tank, every aircraft, every truck. It was the absence of aircraft where aircraft should have been. A senior officer noted quietly, "We are living in the ruins of decisions made years ago." In the final weeks of the war, Allied intelligence examined captured German documents. They found detailed analyses from the Abwehr describing American production rates, analyses that had been accurate, clear, and thorough. One American intelligence officer wrote, "They knew everything. They simply did not believe what they knew." Among the captured papers was a German intelligence report dated April 20th, 1945, Hitler's last birthday. The document confirmed Willow Run's production numbers, 650 aircraft per month at peak, one bomber every 63 minutes, thousands of workers across multiple shifts, more aluminum consumed monthly than all of Germany combined. The report concluded, "We reported these numbers 2 years ago. We were dismissed. It was a confession, a lament, and a warning all at once. Willow Run had become the symbol of the industrial war Germany refused to understand. It had built not only machines but proof that democracy could produce strength, that diversity empowered industry, and that freedom created efficiency. The factory Germany mocked had built the weapon that ended the Reich. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler took his own life. 1 week later, Germany surrendered. There were no more Luftwaffe squadrons, no more secret weapons, no more illusions. The war in the air had not merely weakened Germany, it had dissolved its ability to fight on land, to move supplies, to reinforce positions, to sustain its industry, or even to maintain the belief that victory was possible. In Nuremberg, months later, surviving intelligence officers testified. They described the reports they had prepared, the warnings they had issued, the numbers they had delivered, the disbelief they encountered. Walter Schellenberg said, "Our intelligence was accurate. Our acceptance of intelligence was fatal." Albert Speer admitted, "To accept the truth about American production was to accept defeat. Therefore, the truth was not accepted." History would judge these statements harshly, but they were honest. After the war, Allied investigators interviewed workers from Willow Run. Many had never left Michigan during the war. They had never seen Europe, never flown in a bomber, never witnessed the destruction their labor helped create. One of the most iconic interviews came from Rose Will Monroe, a real-life Rosie the Riveter. She had been a factory worker, installing rivets on B-24 Liberators. She said, "We didn't think about being heroes. We punched in, did our shift, and went home. We wanted our boys to come back." Later at a post-war event, Monroe met former Luftwaffe pilot Hans Rudel. When he asked how Americans built so many bombers so quickly, she replied, "We worked every day, everyone, that's all." Rudel reportedly responded, "We were told democracy made you weak. We were told lies. Those lies destroyed us." Their exchange captured the entire tragedy of the war in a single moment. One side built strength through inclusion and cooperation. The other destroyed itself through arrogance and ideology. In the decades that followed, military historians repeatedly returned to one question: how could German intelligence have been so accurate, yet Germany's leadership be so catastrophically wrong? The answer appeared in every testimony: cognitive bias stronger than data, ideology stronger than arithmetic, ego stronger than mathematics, leadership that punished truth, a system that demanded belief, not understanding. Dr. Gerhard Weinberg summarized it best. Germany lost the war the moment it refused to accept the truth. Its own intelligence service had delivered. The truth had been clear. The numbers had been undeniable. The evidence had been overwhelming. Willow Run, its assembly lines, its workers, its relentless output, was the embodiment of the reality Germany could not face. And so the war ended not with a final battle, but with the consequences of ignoring truth. A final German intelligence report, never delivered, put it plainly. Reality does not bend to ideology. Truth ignored becomes tragedy. Those words were written in 1945. They echo still.